Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live. We are in Ottawa, Ontario. It is Congress 2015, the Canadian Historical Association annual meeting. It's the last day of that, and we talked with Michel Duquet on the recap episode, and he noted that there's a lot of public historians here, and that's a changing face of the Canadian Historical Association, and we're thrilled today to have one of those public historians with us, Jodi Giesbrecht, the acting manager of research and curation at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for doing this. This is really cool for us to talk about a new museum, which has only been open for about 6 months now. But we'll start the show with by saying that we are not going to be talking about the history of the museum up until this point and sort of the political backdrop of it and the turnover in staff and all those issues. Those have been well documented elsewhere. The point of what we're doing today is to talk about the exhibits and what is currently on display in Winnipeg and the process, the historical process that went into putting up those exhibitions. So, you know, if you're clicking on this to get some sort of dirt on the museum, that's not what this is about. We're not going to gossip about any of those things. We're just going to talk about, you know, the exhibits as they sit right now in what is, now I was there a couple of years ago, a beautiful building. And you were just saying that, you know, everyone is centralized in the building, so and you're close to the exhibit so you can talk to visitors. And I'm just wondering, like, being in that type of facility first off, what is that like for you?
It's really exciting. It is a facility that's quite unique in the sense that all of our offices are really integrated into the museum. So we're visible from the gallery spaces. We're able to interact with visitors quite easily. So it's really a way of kind of keeping a pulse on how people are responding. And you can work on an exhibit for months and years, and you still don't know how it's going to be received.
Sure.
So it's really great to be able to hear visitors and especially school kids and see their reactions.
But if you were being perfectly honest, you would say that, now this is me guessing, that when the museum actually opened, you were a little annoyed that all these people were around. You enjoyed the quiet, I bet, right? That had to have been a bit of a change in your working environment that probably took some getting used to.
Oh, for sure. There was definitely, a few times where we wondered what all these people were doing in our galleries, and then realizing that that's right, we did this for visitors.
Right. Yes.
So I mean, it's getting used to a different kind of level of noise. And,
right.
Yeah.
So the museum, of course, is called the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and it was pointed out in the session. So 3 curators came from the museum, and you had a session on Monday afternoon, I believe. It was the first session of the afternoon, and talked about the museum and the process of curating the museum. One of the things that was said in that panel was that this is the only national museum outside of the National Capital Region.
There is also Pier 21 in Nova Scotia, which is also a national museum. So the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is the first to be built from the ground up outside the National Capital Region. Yeah.
So the only one west of the National Capital Region.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because, I mean, I think, in this town, perhaps sometimes we get sort of flippant towards museum because there's so many of them here.
Yeah.
We just think that they're just a part of life everywhere. But here's something unique in Winnipeg to have this national museum. And I'm just wondering, that initial response from the community once the museum opened, is there a sense of that this is something cool that is there and that people are really responding to it?
There is, yes. I think, given the subject matter and some of the difficult stories covered, we weren't entirely sure how visitors or the public would respond. And, our levels of visitor satisfaction have been through the roof. It's a really great thing for Winnipeg and for Canada. And being a national museum, we really did keep national representation in mind. So, it's not just a Winnipeg museum, but it really is a museum for Canada.
And, there are certainly issues associated with that we'll get into a little bit later, and I'm thinking particularly linguistic issues of a national museum in Winnipeg. But before we get into those sorts of things, human rights is an interesting concept, an interesting idea. And I'm just wondering, how does the museum define human rights? Because this is an issue that, again, came up in this panel of, there are certain things that from the outside people might look at as a human rights issue, whereas the people involved in them might not. And so this question of definition of human rights, how did the museum define the term just in order to understand what could and should be included in your collections?
That was and is probably one of the most difficult aspects of, creating and curating a museum on something as abstract as human rights, because, there are 1,000 different definitions. Everyone will have a different definition of what human rights are. Some people will point to legal structures or frameworks, others moral and ethical ideals. There are different global perspectives on human rights. And so we really tried to incorporate that diversity into the exhibitions to show that, there is no agreed upon definition. This is what it means to some people. This is what it means to other people. So, really trying to present multiple perspectives and different voices, which, is difficult, but also allows us to present so many different kinds of stories.
And in that sense, is it important then to include people on their terms and how they self-identify or how they would define human rights so that you're not imposing something upon them?
Right, yeah, exactly. And one way that we've been able to do that is through a lot of digital technology. So we have different, multimedia installations where we asked people who are involved in human rights, but not necessarily, very famous. What do human rights mean to them? Right. And we integrate those really kind of raw elements of their experience alongside, overviews of international declarations, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So really showing, we've got legal structures, but this is also how people live their rights and work for rights. And I think, one of the overarching themes that comes out is the way that human rights have been used as tools for social change, and just trying to show, the many different forms that takes.
And because, it's not static. I think, you can think of things of, like foreign aid and these sorts of things as addressing human rights issues and things like genocide and those sorts of things. But there are smaller things, too, like just the general marginalization of certain groups that is maybe not as well defined as other things, right? Like so those are all human rights issues, because ultimately human rights would come down to equality, would it not, if you were sort of to simplify it, that all people are people and deserve to be treated with respect, and that it's the way in which people are not treated as equal and marginalized and pushed aside. That's really where human rights comes into play. Yeah,
I mean, there are those core concepts, right? Equality, justice, dignity, respect. And I think really where the key role of historians comes in is, looking at the ways in which those concepts existed at a time when, let's say, the legal frameworks or the language of human rights as we use it today did not exist, right? So the rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada in the 19th century, not exactly a struggle for human rights, but there were certain concepts that might resonate with, more contemporary ideas of human rights. So it's really a challenge to situate things kind of historically while also bringing out those core concepts.
And you mentioned before we started recording that the staff that you have is very diverse, that it's not just historians. And given the diversity and the complexity of these issues, I'm sure that's really important that you have people from different backgrounds and who have been trained in different ways to really issues.
Yeah, that's right. And, we're not a museum of history, so we do have staff with a background in history, but also political science and law, cultural studies. So there is, as you mentioned, that really kind of fruitful dialogue that we're able to have.
So when people come to the museum, I'm sure there's an expectation that they have just from the name of the museum. I mean, that would have some sort of meaning to them. When they come, what are they exposed to? I mean, if I'm a visitor, I enter the museum, what do I see? What should I expect when I get there?
So the museum offers an experience that's really quite different from a lot of museums. All of the different galleries are interconnected, and they're also many of them open to one another. And they're all connected through a series of alabaster ramps that kind of crisscross the museum. It's a bit of a labyrinth, really. And
the building is circular, right? Like it's not.
It's partially circular. There are a few different components. There's the part that does look circular is comprised of these kind of glass. They almost look like the wings of a dove that fold in, and then there's also more of a kind of jagged element that's made up of limestone.
Okay.
And so the architect intended for the limestone areas to represent mountains. The glass is intended to kind of represent glaciers. And then there are also 4 roots that come out of the building and, quite literally root the museum in the ground.
Okay.
And so the architect really intended for visitors to, you kind of enter by going down into the ground, and then you ascend through the galleries.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these ramps are sort of taking you through in that way. So it's not. Is it a situation where visitors are? I mean, not this is going to be a terrible equation, but like IKEA, where you sort of are going through a set route, or do you have freedom of movement where I go to this gallery and then to this gallery? Or is it sort of almost a predefined?
Yeah. There is a preferred route, which is taking the ramps, kind of from bottom to top, but certainly visitors can start at whichever floor they want. Some choose to start at the top and come down. Some go to, one gallery or another. People have different interests, so a Canadian historian might go straight to the Canadian Journeys gallery and spend most of their time there.
And it was mentioned the other day that the material is presented thematically as opposed to chronologically. I'm wondering why that decision was made. You mentioned it's not a history museum, and generally history museums would go chronologically because that's an easy way to tell a story or maintain a narrative. This decision to go thematically, that obviously would present some unique challenges. And how do you, as the curator, try to overcome that and create something that is cohesive,
right,
yet not chronologic?
It is quite challenging. I think, if you think of the subject of human rights, to present that in a chronological narrative, it would be a little bit disingenuous, really, because it would really suggest kind of a narrative of progress, I think.
Right.
Even if we introduced elements of rights violations and setbacks, just in that layout, there would still be this narrative imposed. Yeah. So in keeping with a human rights approach, we thought that a thematic methodology would be better able to kind of really capture that complexity and, the kind of the steps and the missteps as well that have really characterized human rights stories and issues. So that was really the rationale. And, I think it works. I think it's a different kind of museum experience, but it really does let us look at the subject matter in a different way.
And when you say thematically, is it themes in terms of genocide versus slavery versus whatever, or is it events and certain cases, or so is it a case study situation, or is it broader themes and saying, well, here was a type of human rights violation that happened here, it also happened here, and so when you say thematically, how do you define those themes?
Well, maybe we use a few of those different approaches, so I can walk you through the galleries very briefly. So the first major gallery that visitors enter is called What Are Human Rights? And fittingly. And so it's intended to present the many different definitions and perspectives on human rights that have existed, throughout history. The next gallery, which is sort of part of the initial gallery, is called Indigenous Perspectives. And that gallery examines concepts of rights and responsibilities, but from an Indigenous perspective. So things like traditional knowledge, a lot of oral histories and that kind of thing. The next gallery is called Canadian Journeys, and that is the largest gallery in the museum. It's got about 10,000 square feet of exhibit space. And so that's really a bit of a patchwork kind of assemblage of stories, historical, contemporary, spanning different regions of Canada, different human rights issues. From there's a smaller gallery called Protecting Rights in Canada, which is very focused on law. So, content on the Charter, different constitutional documents, key Supreme Court cases, that kind of thing. From there, the content becomes a little bit more international in scope. So there's a gallery on the Holocaust and defining genocide, a gallery on the creation of international declarations, covenants, as well as grassroots movements around the world to protect human rights. A gallery called Breaking the Silence, which is about mass atrocities and genocide, but also people's efforts to speak out against these kinds of abuses. And from there, the content then gets a bit more contemporary. So there are a couple galleries that are really oriented towards youth. So stories about bullying or, creating gay-straight alliances at school, those kinds of things, and, using interactive games and engaging ways to get kids involved. And then there's also a gallery called Rights Today, which is very contemporary and very global. So those are some of the main kind of thematic approaches that frame the galleries.
And I agree that I think that's a really good approach to it, because chronologic one is filled with problems for an issue like this, because you don't want it to seem like, well, it's always getting better, because it's not necessarily true. But the going thematically also presents a challenge of that these things are so active, right? And things change so much with regards to human rights. I mean, just sitting here yesterday, as we record, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was released. So that's something that would be of interest to the Human Rights Museum. I also read the story of a kid, a valedictorian, I think in Colorado, who submitted his speech for approval, and in his speech he was coming out, and the school said, no, you can't do this, and they basically banned him from being valedictorian. I mean, and that's an issue that would be a human rights issue as well. So these things are continuing to evolve. So just from a methodological perspective, I mean, how do you ensure that the galleries are kept up to date? Because these sorts of issues would affect pretty much the whole museum as you move forward.
That's a great question. The museum is really kind of a living and breathing museum. It makes heavy use of digital technologies, which allow us to update content a little bit easier than, let's say, a large display of artifacts or, other kind of more permanent installations. So some of our exhibits use technology in a way that is really quite contemporary. So we've got a large interactive map of contemporary human rights issues that incorporates a Twitter feed and an RSS feed, a photo stream that is, constantly evolving. So through a few ways like that, we can stay quite current. And, it's always been our intention that the exhibits would evolve. We have one story about the right to die that focused on the Sue Rodriguez case. And, shortly after the museum opened, there was a new ruling. So, we're constantly updating the content.
So with that being said, I mean, what would you say is the expected lifespan of some of these exhibits? Is the intention for, a 5, 10-year, 15-year exhibit, or is it sort of just update as we need?
It kind of depends on the nature of the exhibit. So some are a little bit more permanent than others. The ones that, rely more on, kind of a recreated setting or artifacts, whereas digital exhibits are a little bit easier to update. And then given the subject matter, so, the gallery Rights Today, just given the very concept of that gallery, it's one that we're looking to, continuously be updating.
You mentioned the use of different things to display the human rights. I believe this was mentioned the other day, too, that it's not a museum that is interested, or it's not primarily interested in collecting artifacts.
Right, yeah.
So when you say that we're displaying these things, sure, the digital stuff is great, but say the Holocaust or other historical things, if there's not a focus on collecting artifacts, what sort of materials are you using to tell those stories?
Well, we do display some artifacts. They're not from our own collection, so we have kind of a loan program where we've loaned artifacts and objects from institutions really all over the world. And because, there are different periods of loans, that's also a way that the exhibits are constantly renewing. But alongside the artifacts, we use a lot of digital forms of presentation, so everything from films to interactives, that kind of thing. Our collections are based more on oral histories and other kind of born digital items. And we've also integrated those oral histories into the exhibitions. So you mentioned the Holocaust Gallery. That gallery does combine, very short documentary films on, personal experiences with some artifacts on loan. So it's really kind of a combination. I think the difference is, as opposed to a lot of museums which start from the collection to tell the story, we kind of find objects to help us tell the story.
Right, yeah. Find the story first, and then the object can fill in. My comparisons are all going to seem flippant given the subject matter, but it's the way Seinfeld did things too, like the show. It was, the other shows would have, we want this guest star, let's find something for them to do. Seinfeld would say, well, here's the story now, let's bring in the guest star.
Who are we going to,
Right, it's that idea of, let's have the story first. And that's not to be critical of other museums that are based on collections, because the collections are usually often pretty cool and reflective of their own thing. It's just a different approach that you have at that museum. The other issue that came up a lot on Monday was the primary accounts that exist throughout the museum. And you mentioned short documentaries that you use. I believe it was Isabel who talked about her work with Aboriginal communities.
Oh, that was Emily.
Oh, Emily, excuse me. Talking about her work with Aboriginal communities and getting firsthand accounts of what's going on. And I'm just wondering, though, you're dealing in these cases with oftentimes people who, again, would be categorized as victims, or as people who have been marginalized. What is the approach to getting these voices?
Yeah.
And are some of these people maybe hesitant to participate for a variety of reasons as to why they would be?
Yeah.
And how do you overcome some of those challenges in dealing with these types of communities?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And it is a constant challenge between representing the gravity of these issues and, the very serious injustices, both historical and contemporary, and not presenting people as victims.
Right.
And so, in using oral histories or stories, I think that is a way of empowering people and really letting them tell the story on their own terms. We are committed to shared authority, and so, we don't use oral histories or stories that we don't have permission to use.
Sure.
And so, there is an ethical obligation to working really closely with those people whose stories that we tell.
Within that, though, there's an issue of authority, right? That as the museum, there's a certain level of authority that you have. And Dean Oliver, in his address, mentioned that the trust that the public has in museums, that they're viewed as very trustworthy. Even though you're going to these people and saying, we want to do this on your terms, ultimately, you're setting up the camera, you're asking the questions. Is there any fear that they might try to cater to what they think you want? And how do you ensure that they're comfortable telling their stories and ensure that it truly is on their terms?
Well, I think it's even more complicated because sometimes their terms are not our terms,
sure,
right? And so I think there's a difference between having an open slate and going to people with sort of a defined approach, and this is the story that we would like to tell. And that's really what we do. There's still a lot of, quite important and rigorous research, archival and otherwise, that goes into creating these exhibits, right? So it's not a matter of integrating stories without any kinds of curatorial interpretation, because that's just not possible. Right?
Yeah. So
it is a bit of a balancing act, and these are issues that museums are still really working out, because it is a fairly new approach.
Yeah, and that issue of interpretation is important because these are sensitive issues and very deeply personal issues, and given that it's not a history museum, these are issues that are ongoing, and the people who are still alive and have to address these on a daily basis. So you want to make sure that you're not being exploitative,
right?
At all. You want to meet them on their terms, and this issue of empowerment is really interesting because when you watch the Truth and Reconciliation Commission stuff, I know this is big too for victims of rape, the use of the word survivor as this form of empowerment, and that they're not victims, that they've survived some sort of a trauma, and that is an empowering moment and that sort of language. But at the same time, I guess you don't also want to be dismissive of it.
Right. Yeah.
You really want to understand the gravity of what has happened without victimizing. Like that balance strikes me as something that is incredibly difficult and something that you must struggle with on a daily basis.
Yeah, oh, for sure. It's exactly that. It's recognizing the scale and the scope of injustice and really, doing our part to represent the fullness of that. But I think in a way that can also then really underscore the idea of resiliency and working against victimization, because people have come out of that and they are speaking out. And so there's, I think, a lot of misconception about the museum, that it's, a shop of horrors or just a genocide museum. And while, of course, those issues are there and they're difficult and we deal with them very seriously, there are also the stories of resilience and overcoming and people who come out of this and work to defend rights of themselves and others. So it's a very fine balancing act for sure.
And that issue too of this preconception of a house of horrors, I can see why people would have that, but at the same time you've been talking as well about ways to engage your visitors. And I had this discussion the other day with some people, and it's this notion of a museum as entertainment, because Dean Oliver mentioned this, that the people who are on the Gatineau side of the river, which is where the Canadian Museum of History is, and if you don't know who Dean Oliver is, listeners, he's the head of research at the Canadian Museum of History, and he mentioned that for them, two of their bigger competitors in terms of getting people into the museum, it's the casino, which is just down the road from the museum, and the water park, which is about a 20-minute drive out of town, because that's where families are going. So to a certain degree then, you have to view the museum as entertainment, because that's the market in which the museum is competing. That being said, your museum deals with issues that wouldn't really be seen as entertaining. So I'm just wondering, how do you find that balance of being engaging and entertaining to a degree that you can keep people's attention, get them through the door, without exploiting the material or treating it in a glib manner? That's
definitely a challenge. And, I think people have certain conceptions about the museum, and yes, they do want to be entertained, but I don't think they come with the same sort of expectations that they would go to a different museum. They know there's going to be some challenging content. They know it's going to be a different kind of experience. That said, we do use of storytelling approaches and different forms of digital interactives and use technology to really draw people in, integrating some of the exhibits with social media and really trying to find a way to appeal to visitors that keeps them connected to the subject matter.
And in that context, what have you found is the audience been like in terms of demographically? Is it are families coming, or is it maybe given the subject matter people don't want to bring their kids, or because of the subject matter people do want to bring their kids? I mean, what are you finding in terms of who's showing up?
We haven't had a lot of families with young kids in terms of the general public who visit. It does tend to be a bit more of a mature crowd, but we do also have school programs of all different ages, and so a lot of different age groups and school groups are coming in every day. Right. We do also offer a free evening every Wednesday, and so far in that evening the demographics have been all over the place, really quite diverse.
And I mean, it's still new too, so I mean, you haven't been through a summer season yet, so you see what that is like. You say what you will about the jokes about Winnipeg. Going out on a Saturday afternoon when it's minus 30 to a museum might not be the thing that a lot of people want to do. So in the summer, spring, summer, maybe some of those things shift. Once kids are out of school too, maybe weekdays, families are looking for stuff to do. So maybe you'll get more people in that respect too, or even just, I mean, again, it's new. I mean, it's probably too early to really say this is the demographic. Yeah,
and even, during spring break a month or two ago, a lot more families than usual. So I do think during the summer we'll absolutely get that demographic coming in.
Have you talked to parents who have brought their kids about their decision to bring their kids, and is there anything in the museum that has any sort of discretion label or anything that says this might not be great for young kids?
Right now we don't have labels or warnings on the exhibits, but it's something we are discussing. We did have, kind of a panel of expert auditors come through and look for child-friendly exhibits or things that they thought kids should be accompanied. So that is something we're still kind of working on and developing maybe a parent's guide, just so that parents are fully informed about where they can feel comfortable taking their kids.
Because it's a similar debate as, I don't know if you've been paying attention to the debate in Ontario about the sexual education curriculum.
Right.
And this notion of the government in Ontario wants to introduce sexual education earlier, starting out with stuff as simple as like understanding body parts as early as the first grade. And some parents are saying, well, it's too young to introduce some of these themes. And it's a debate that's ongoing in this province. And that's a similar thing that you would be dealing with, in that some of these issues, some parents would say that the kids are too young to be exposed to that.
And kids have different levels of maturity, and they're ready for different things at different times. So it is really a matter of equipping parents to understand, what galleries deal with what subject matter. And in terms of school programs, those are aligned with our provincial curriculum.
Right.
So the themes that students are studying in school already are kind of aligned or integrated with the programs that we offer.
And it's good to do that, because it's one thing to read something in a book, right? But if you have the opportunity to go and either see photos or if you can get a first-person narrative out of it, and there's something powerful about that. And, you don't want a 5-year-old to see certain things, right? You just don't want that. But at the same time, I think it's important, this is me personally, feel as though it's important that kids understand that these things exist in the world, and not to get all after school special, but ultimately they're the ones who are hopefully going to change the world and overcome some of these problems. So once each individual child is ready to process some of this and be exposed to it, I think it's important that they understand that the world isn't perfect. You might even argue that the world isn't even good in certain cases, and having them understand that is important, and that's why I think this museum can really be more than just a museum. It can be a real service moving forward in addressing these issues.
And the final gallery of the museum is called Inspiring Change, and it is more of a programming space, and there's an opportunity to kind of fill out a card about your kind of reflections on what you've learned, or maybe a pledge that you want to make or take. So that idea of inspiring change is really quite important too, and a key objective of a lot of the content.
Now, you've mentioned the use of social media, and obviously this final gallery, a lot of user-generated content. What was the initial push for that, and why did you feel, or why did the museum feel it was important to include user-generated content in the galleries?
Well, it's a way of, I think, broadening the reach of the museum, a way of engaging a wider audience of visitors, a way of kind of targeting that demographic who really lives in the world of social media. And it's a way to also keep the exhibits really evolving and dynamic and kind of more inclusive and reflective of the wider public.
The issue with that, of course, is that you are in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and it's a lovely place, but not as big of a Francophone community as would be present in Ottawa, say. Yeah. But you are a national museum, therefore bilingualism is important and is key. But if you're having all this user-generated content, a vast majority of which in a city like Winnipeg, I imagine, is coming in English. And Tim Stanley asked this question in the panel, or how do you ensure that there's some sort of bilingual representation when so much of what you're getting is in English?
It is a challenge. Winnipeg does have quite a thriving Francophone community. So we do have some submissions in French. All of our offer is bilingual. So, when people are tweeting, or, we have a Share Your Story booth, when those stories are being shared, we do have to keep in mind linguistic parity for sure. So, sometimes that means our options in terms of selecting French stories is a bit more limited than English, but we've also just opened, and so, over time we'll be able to, I think, amass a greater kind of French language collection.
Has there been any discussion of, for user-generated content, I mean, in a digital world, you can get a lot of it without people actually being at the museum. And you talk about the digital exhibits that you have. That been discussed is to try to solicit submissions from people who may not be present in Winnipeg.
Yes, that's definitely a consideration. And, it's part of our mandate of being a national museum. And so, one of the exhibits that I touched on the other day was our same-sex marriage exhibit. And so that exhibit features photographs of different same-sex couples from across Canada. And so to solicit those photographs, we did a public call-out and, made media contacts across the country. And we did receive submissions from almost every province and territory, which was really quite great and, evidence of our ability to kind of reach out nationally.
And so are you finding that, in terms of the digital presence too, that there is an awareness nationally of the museum? Obviously, there's a big presence in Winnipeg, and people in Winnipeg and Manitoba generally would be aware of it. But are you hearing from people in Halifax and Victoria and points in between about what you're doing?
We are. We did an awareness survey several years ago about whether people knew about the museum, and the number was quite low. And did another survey quite recently, and the number has increased by a fair bit. So awareness is definitely growing, and over time we'll also be developing traveling exhibits, so exhibits that we develop in-house, we'll show at the museum, but then also send out on the road, and so it's also a way for us to kind of broaden our national scope and reach.
Now, there's another issue that I've sort of left to this point, but is this notion of activism. And in something like human rights, we talk about that you don't want to treat people as victims, but at the same time, do you want to treat the other side, people, as perpetrators of things? Because in that sense, you could be seen as an activist museum, and I don't know if that's really the goal, so much as to just present these things as this happens.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm just wondering if we talked about how the survivors of these things are presented. How are the people who on the other side of it? I mean, how do you present, say, the Nazis in the Holocaust exhibit?
That's a good question, and I mean, in a way, it's saying this happened, but of course, as we already touched on, there are so many elements of how we present the information that, we're never just saying this happened.
Sure. Sure. That interpretation stopped a long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, although, I think a lot of members of the public still sort of expect that. Right. It is certainly difficult, and, especially when we're dealing with so many different kinds of issues and historical issues, contemporary issues. So there is an element of, describing what happened, showing evidence. We try to use primary documents when we can and let visitors really engage with those documents. And so I think that's some of the ways in which they learn about, not just human rights violations, but also some of the processes or the mechanisms through which violations happen, right? So why did the government of Canada turn away the Komagata Maru, right? And, by asking some of those questions, I think some of these issues can be examined. Right.
Because sometimes I feel as though when people ask the question of why do people do this, it's often seen as a way to excuse the behavior. Yeah. Which I don't think it is. It's trying to understand as to how these things happen, because one of the reasons we want to ask why it happened, how it happened, is to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if you don't ask those questions, it seems as though oftentimes people are just demonized and said, well, this is a bad person, and that's why they did that. When oftentimes that doesn't really explain what happened. And so in exploring human rights violations, understanding the violators and how they got to this point without excusing it, because of course you don't want to excuse it, but you also don't want to just say, evil people, bad people. Like that's not productive either.
Right. Yeah.
And so that would be another fine line amongst many that you would have to deal with.
Yeah, for sure. And it's an effort to show, I think, again, that emphasis on mechanisms. So what are the mechanisms through which some of these violations happen? Right. So if we're talking about the Holocaust, how did, the German people become complicit? And in asking some of those questions, you're combining analysis of perpetrators with an examination of mechanisms. And, we're also cautious to not draw easy lessons or, take the silver lining approach. That happened, but hey, look what happened next. And so, sometimes that requires leaving things a bit ambiguous or open-ended, right? And so we're not necessarily telling visitors how they should think or feel about some of these issues, which is, a little bit of a challenging approach as well.
But it's also authentic.
Right.
And that these issues don't have easy answers.
Yeah, and it's also, this kind of goes back to that thematic approach that we take. It's showing the different ways that issues are relevant in different contexts and in different frameworks. So, the issue of Indian residential schools appears in several of the museum's galleries, but framed in different ways. Right. So in the Canadian Journeys Gallery, which is a bit more historical, there's an exhibit on residential schools that also looks at the 60s scoop and contemporary child welfare practices. So trying to achieve a few objectives, one showing the ongoing legacy and impacts today, but then also integrating the story in the narrative of Canadian history to suggest, this is an issue that concerns everybody. This is not, an Aboriginal issue. Right. Residential schools then also appears in the gallery Breaking the Silence, which is about, speaking out about gross violations of human rights. And in that gallery, it is framed more within the context of genocide and understanding what that means. Residential schools then also appears in our more youth-oriented galleries, and it uses a project that involves school children who create these tiles, these artistic tiles, to speak about reconciliation. So I think in the different ways that stories are framed, we can examine a lot of these questions in different ways, and that's how visitors make a connection to the stories. Right,
because it's very personal that way.
Right,
and you'd like the world to be as simple as just be nice to each other. Right? Yeah. We like that to be true.
That would be great.
That would be great. But the world isn't that simple. Yeah. And personalizing these stories. And it's interesting, too, because I've read some stuff about how, if there's an earthquake or a hurricane and people see, 2,000 people die, those fundraising efforts for that aren't as effective as when it's one person who has suffered some sort of calamity. That when you personalize it, there's a greater response from people as opposed to mass numbers. So, bringing in those types of stories and having people speak in their own words is really a great way to to connect visitors to these stories and to get them engaged.
Yeah, it's really a way of humanizing what are really quite abstract concepts or, concepts that can become quite legalistic in a lot of ways. And so by really bringing that kind of personal voice, it's really quite affective and draws visitors in. Right,
and because it's really easy to become numb to stats and legalese. Yeah. Where it's harder to be numb to a human being. Exactly. Like a face and a name to something. And there was an exhibit at the War Museum that was I can't remember the exact name of it, so I won't try. But it was photographs of different things, and it was very personal because it told stories of women in war-affected areas. Right. And it was their photographs over 7 years, I believe. And it was really quite remarkable in that you hear about what happens in these areas, but it's broad, it's abstract. But then this actually happened to this person. Yeah. She's telling her story. Like it suddenly becomes real.
Yeah, and what we've also tried to do, in fitting with our national mandate, is integrate Canadian content into every gallery. So even the gallery on the Holocaust, the main film that shows in the theater in that gallery is about anti-Semitism in Canada during the 1930s. So, turning away Jewish refugees, the riot at Christie Pitts Park, that kind of thing. In the gallery Rights Today, which is very global and contemporary. You know, there are Canadian stories in every exhibit. So that's also a way of kind of getting visitors' attention and showing that, you know, there are connections between what happens in Canada and what happens in a lot of other parts of the world.
Well, to that end, have you found that visitors, Canadian visitors, are surprised by the amount of human rights issues that exist in this country? I think a lot of people have this notion of, well, Canada, it's peaceful, it's great. You know, everyone gets along, it's a swell country. Are people sometimes surprised that there are the number of issues, human rights issues in this country that are presented in the museum? Like, would people come to expect a more foreign focus on these issues and maybe taken aback by really the extensive issues that we've had in this country's history?
Yeah. I think it's a bit mixed. I would say the stories that might surprise visitors the most are some of these more historical stories. So like anti-Semitism in the 30s. A lot of people don't know that history.
Right.
And so they do find those stories, I think, surprising. You know, they also come with a critical eye. And so, you know, I think, you know, there is public awareness that, you know, Canada's human rights record is mixed. And so I don't think visitors are necessarily expecting to see a rosy narrative.
Right, because, I mean, how could you?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, it's not a museum that is celebratory, nor is it a museum that is condemning.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
It's
really about education, right? And, you know, learning about issues in order to, you know, as cheesy as this sounds, in order to make a better world, really.
Right. Yeah. And ultimately that's what we want. I mean, we don't want human rights violations in this world.
Yeah.
Right? We don't. So creating awareness of the issues that surround human rights issues is important.
Yeah.
So if I'm in Winnipeg and I want to go see the museum, how do I do that?
Well, the museum is it's located at the Forks,
Yes.
which is quite central in Winnipeg, which is also a really important meeting ground. You know, it's a space that Indigenous peoples have been meeting at for hundreds of years. It's located on Treaty 1 land as well. And so it's quite central, integrated into the city. It's also a very large building, so you can't miss it.
It is easy to spot,
Yeah.
I have to admit. When I walked out of the train station, I just sort of turned around and, oh, that's it.
Right there, yeah.
It's hard to miss.
Yeah.
And generally the hours would be what for folks?
Generally Tuesday to Sunday, 10 to 5. We're open later Wednesday evenings and closed Mondays right now, but we will be open Mondays during the summer in anticipation of higher visitor levels.
Right. And moving forward, I mean, we talked about how it's very much a living museum and exhibits, and you're working on some temp stuff to travel around. And is that sort of the focus now, that the large-scale permanent exhibits are done? Is it sort of updating and now working on these travel exhibits? Is that the main focus of this one?
Yeah, it's updating, you know, planning to replace certain exhibits. We do also have 2 temporary gallery spaces. And so, you know, while eventually we'll exhibit shows that we produce, we also host shows that come from other institutions. So there's quite a dynamic changeover of content there too.
So exciting times.
It is.
A
It's
new
very
museum
exciting.
and looking at new stuff. So anyone who's in Winnipeg, we would highly recommend you go and check it out and bother the curators while they're in their office right next to the exhibit.
We're open to the public, yeah.
So, Jodi Giesbrecht, Acting Manager, Research and Curation, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights.
That's right.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thanks for having me.
If you have any questions or comments for the show, historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @DrShawneeFever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.